Mm. Yeah, that's super helpful. I was thinking I'm doing some work on C.S. Lewis right now for my thesis, and he talks about before he became an atheist, like he had this vision of God who was up there watching us, and occasionally someone would say a prayer, and like he'd intervene, and like he'd just fix the problems, and like that was his vision of God, and he quickly came to realize like that is not who God is. God is not like we have this vision of having these like you say this perfect prayer, and then you're set, and then you say your prayer every once in a while, and God will help you out, but like that is just not the Christian story, and I don't think that's what most people experience. And there is a lot of value in experiencing and working together to kind of solve these things. So do you see that same value in having us wrestle through these things rather than just being like these like drop down answers from heaven to solve all of our serious questions?
Yeah, I like the parallel C.S. Lewis illustration. I think that's very opposite. When I've talked about the problem of evil, so I sometimes give the illustration, like because people will often ask, well, why didn't God just create heaven at the beginning? If heaven's the end goal, why not just avoid all the evil and suffering that comes along the way? And I said, well, here's an analogy that you have two different scenarios. In scenario one, you get dropped off on the mountain peak, and then you can do your sightseeing, and then the helicopter picks you up later. On scenario two, you end up at the mountain peak as well, but not because you were dropped off by a helicopter, but because you slowly climbed up the mountain peak with a team. And all of you were collectively exerting yourself, expending great, enormous amounts of energy, helping each other, showing courage and so on, selflessness, and eventually getting to the top of the mountain. Both of those leave you at the top of the mountain at the end. But I think the second one, you can argue that it is preferable to the first one in the sense that there are intrinsic values, like the value of courage and fortitude and stick-to-itiveness and generosity, that you have to cultivate as you work together up the mountain to climb the mountain versus just getting dropped off by a helicopter. And in the same way that if you have a text that is completely without ambiguity, you can say, well, that's like getting dropped off on the helicopter. There's value there, no doubt, but there's greater value that is added with a text that has some degree of interpretive ambiguity that you wrestle through as a reading community and slowly climb up the mountain to arrive at the correct interpretation. So it seems to me that there's a lot of intuitive plausibility there.
Yeah, it's interesting because I took a leadership class in high school, Randall, and we had this question that was brought up so many times. It's like, would you rather learn through experience or rather the teacher just telling you like what's the right answer and the wrong answer? And like everyone in the class had experience, and like it wasn't in a context related to like biblical ambiguity or like the problem of evil, but like it's just like it seems like intuitively like that's the common like human thing is we want to learn through experience rather than just be dropped on top of the mountain. So I appreciate that.
Now, I agree 100%, but I also want to steel man the objector. So the objector is going to say, okay, that's fine if you're like learning from experience and like figuring out how to assemble a product or something. But what you have in Christian history is you have Christians who have often interpreted passages in Scripture to justify actions that we consider to be moral atrocities. So, for example, I talk about Oliver Cromwell invading in Ireland and committing genocidal atrocities against the Irish and justifying them with respect to a particular interpretive appeal to Joshua. The same thing when you have the Puritans in North America justifying genocidal actions toward indigenous peoples based upon a particular interpretive reading of Joshua. And a person can say, surely there's a breaking point. Like, how can you justify that and say, well, we over time achieve a greater moral maturity within the community of faith because some of us interpreted Joshua to justify moral atrocities? I appreciate that difficulty. I do think, however, that you can also say, on the other hand, to go back to the skeptical theist response, that just as the problem is much greater, so the diversity for the potential outcomes that happen in the long process of history from divergent readings, wrestling with the ambiguity of the text, that's also so much greater that I just don't think we're in a position definitively to say that God could not have morally sufficient reasons to allow the misreading of texts, even that sometimes lead to the putative justification of moral atrocities. So that, again, that's not going to satisfy everybody, but it does satisfy me, at least.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. There's also something, as you were talking, Randall, with that example, thinking about like intrinsic versus like extrinsic religiosity. So like someone like Oliver Cromwell, like is he like reading Joshua and he's like, oh, I should go slay all the Irish. That'd be really good because it seems like from Joshua that might be something God would want me to do. Or is it Oliver Cromwell wants to go slay the Irish and he's like, well, here's this text in Joshua that seems to align with what I want to do. So maybe I cite that. And sometimes it's just really hard to know. Like, we can't psychoanalyze Oliver Cromwell, but like I have a hard time believing like it's the former of those two situations. So
yeah. There are. You could say, for example, one of the things that the degree of ambiguity that exists does is reveals the heart of people. So, in fact, there are certain people that are already hating their neighbor in essence, and they're looking for a justification for it. And you shouldn't necessarily blame the text for being misused by people who already hate their neighbor and are looking for a justification for their hatred. So, I mean, I think that would be a fair rejoinder.